Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. My name is Edith Hancock. I'm a competition reporter at POLITICO. And I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting this panel today on the Digital Markets Act, What's Next? We want to make this as interactive as possible, so we have this Slido that sometimes works. Basically, we would love it if you could answer the question that we have on there about the Digital Markets Act, what you see the measure of success as. And also, I'm told that I need to ask at least 4 questions from the audience. So please, I'd love to see them, and I would love to read them out later. But before we get started with that, I'd like to welcome onto the stage Stan Larroque, who's the founder and CEO of Lynx, for a few opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to give some remarks before this last and important panel. I'm Stan Larroque. I'm the CEO and founder of Lynx Mixed Reality. We make this kind of objects. We make mixed reality computers or headsets. It's the next computing platforms, and you're going to hear about it a lot in the coming months, I'm sure. All of that is possible thanks to European, Asian, and American partners, including Qualcomm here. It's a hard project, making a headset, making your own ecosystem, your own app store from the ground up. If you told me how hard it is, I wouldn't have done it. But here we are. But some days it's even harder, because the rules of our market, from the supply chain all the way to the consumer market, do not always seem fair. Some other companies can also feel powerless when you're talking on a market dominated by the biggest companies on Earth, which some of them do not play fair at all. To this end, the European Commission created the DMA, and we can be thankful, even not just for the public discussion, it's sorely needed. I had everything thrown at my face. Chinese company trying to steal our tech, a giant social network trying to poach my team behind my back twice, a major competitor, a fruit company, buying one of our major partners. Trust me, it's a free season show on Netflix, but all of that is just business. There are rules. What is beyond all that is the perverse lock-in in our digital lives in virtual silos as consumers with no interoperability and thus no true choice. Start with iMessage and how it turns into a social stigma for American teenagers and soon European ones. What we see on the mobile ecosystem, this monopoly or duopoly, has hurt the consumer and slowed down progress and innovation on many aspects. The same might and probably will happen with mixed reality and the upcoming wave of computing. Now, the true question is, why is it easier to switch between car brands than it is to switch between iOS and Android? And I hope the panel will answer that and how we can address this problem. For too long now, innovation was dominated by large gatekeepers, and the consumer alone could not have an impact or even realize the situation of some digital ecosystems. You do not feel your chains when you're not moving. I'm happy to bring more choice to the consumer with my little headsets for the next platform. It's also a pleasure now to listen to other companies working with policymakers, like Spotify right now, to have a more open digital life and a more thriving competition. Thank you. If you want to test, I will be right there with it.
Thank you very much for that speech. That was a really interesting point about not knowing that you're being restricted when you can't move at all. And with that in mind, I would love to welcome my wonderful panel onto the stage. So first we have Avery Gardiner, who's the Director of Global Competition Policy at Spotify. I feel like doing like a speech day, I think. MEP Andreas Schwab, who was also the reporter for the Digital Markets Act. And last but by no means least, Thomas Kramler, Head of Unit for Digital Platforms. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to speak to me today. I wanted to touch on where we are now with the DMA. So obviously there was a little bit of uncertainty before the designations were actually made of what that was going to look like. Now we're a bit more clear on that, but what happens next is still a bit uncertain. Thomas, I wanted to go straight to you first and ask how conversations with these gatekeepers are going and what you think you're learning about how they find the challenge of complying with these new rules.
Yes, thank you. As you know, the DMA works in phases. We have now gone through the first phase, which was the designation phase. We have designated 6 gatekeepers, 22 core platform services, and have launched 5 market investigations into other core platform services. So that was proof that the Commission is up to the task. We did all of that in 45 days, and as you can imagine, there were quite some intense discussions about the delineation of specific services with some gatekeeper companies. And now we're moving into a second phase, which is the compliance phase. As many of you will know, gatekeepers have 6 months to comply with the obligations in the DMA, all of them, so there's no exception. If they apply to the gatekeeping core platform service, the gatekeepers will have to comply with these obligations. So what we are doing now, between now and the 7th of March, which is compliance day, we are working very intensively with the 6 gatekeeper companies that have been designated in order to discuss their compliance plans. And they all have an interest, I think, to discuss with us, because everybody wants to avoid surprises on the 6th of March. Everybody wants to know the big engineering projects that have to be undertaken in order to be compliant with the DMA, where they're heading. So with all of them, we have intense discussions on what compliance proposals they will put on the table and what compliance is going to look like when we reach the 7th of March deadline. But we're not just discussing with gatekeepers. We also want to invite third parties to help us in ensuring compliance, because there's a big information asymmetry between us and the gatekeepers, as is the case in every regulated industry. The regulator knows much less than the regulated company about the regulated company's products. So we actually need market input, third-party input, very concrete third-party input on the compliance proposals that the gatekeepers are going to make. And here is an open invitation to industry, to third parties to help us in shaping the compliance by the gatekeepers. And that will need to be very concrete, sometimes very technical input that we are missing in order to basically, how would I say, reality check the proposals that the gatekeepers are making. So that's the next phase. And after that, there will be compliance monitoring phase. So we will get a report on compliance by the 7th of March. And then we'll have to very intensively, also with the help of third parties, monitor what kind of compliance has been put in place by the gatekeepers. So there's a lot ahead of us. The work has just started. We've gone through the first initial phase of designation, and now it becomes more and more intense over the next couple of months.
It's interesting that you bring up third parties, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask next. So Avery, what are you looking out for the next 6 months?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and thrilled to hear we will be knocking on your door. But I think that the key is making sure that when we get to March 7th, we have the compliance that brings consumers the benefits they deserve. That was what motivated the DMA in the first place. And I speak from the perspective of Spotify, a European-based company, that in order to reach our customers, we must go through app stores, right? It used to be years ago that people accessed Spotify on the desktop. You may remember that. It's a little hard to remember. It feels like ages ago. But now the way customers interact with the internet is on their mobile phone. And in the case of an iPhone, the only way that we can reach our customers is through that gatekeeper app store. And there are a couple of things that means today we're not allowed to do that would benefit customers. For example, we want to tell people in the app if they can get a special deal, like a holiday promotion. And today's Apple rules don't allow us to do that. That's a worse outcome for customers. And of course, it's a worse outcome for Spotify, because we'd like to have more customers become part of our premium tier. So we are excited that compliance means some of those things will be easy to do on day one. I think you're right. Some of the others are going to be much more technical, like what happens with sideloading in alternative app stores, and what are the ways that companies need to design those alternatives that make sure to protect privacy and security, which is what, by the way, opening things up will do. More competition provides more options for customers to think about how they want to look at security and privacy, and I think will actually lead to improvements in that space if we get it right. So we stand ready to help you in any way that we can, and our engineers are ready to tackle your tough questions.
Andreas, you're part of a working group that's looking into the implementation of the DMA and making sure it's going well. So is it?
Well, that's not yet clear to say. I think there should be some more attention on the excellent work that has been done, but at the same time a bit more pressure on the Commission to really do the best to enforce the DMA with the teeth that we wanted to give it. So I think Thomas has been perfectly outlining that we are in between the 6th of September and the 6th of March. He forgot to speak about the New Year's Eve, because there might be new companies coming in that, with their turnover, have not yet met the thresholds in the last term. So it's very interesting times. We will not wait for the 6th of March asking the Commission. We will already see after the 1st of January if companies that are, let's say, suspicious of being a gatekeeper will have the numbers that are needed. And therefore, there is this meeting in between. On the other side, there was a very nice conference 2 weeks ago in Rome, where there was for sure a very open mindset about how the DMA is working. Because the units that have been created in DG Competition are some sort of, let's say, gray zone. On the one side, they are in DG Competition enforcing competition policy. On the other side, as Thomas Kramler has outlined, they are looking for compliance, speaking, I don't want to say sitting with, I want to say speaking with gatekeepers to understand better how they apply the business models. And that's for sure a challenge, because gatekeepers could also hope that the DMA is some sort of legal tool that protects them against the application of competition policy, and that's what we don't want to see. So it will be very interesting. And the working group that you are referring is a working group of the European Parliament, where we want to exchange a bit with other companies, with the academia, and also with the Commission about how they really want to do step by step the application and the enforcement of the DMA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to know as well I wanted to talk about staffing. So I believe, Schwab, you called for about 180 members of staff to be in the Digital Markets Act unit last year, and that the number has kind of varied of recommendation throughout the years. But Olivier Gersant said last week that we're at 40, which is not 150 or 180. And I just wondered, are you worried about the capacity of the unit to be able to do the job that they can?
I think 40, what he talked about, is the number in DG Competition, but as you might know, this is a joint venture between DG Connect and DG Competition. So on DG Connect side, there's also a similar number. So we're around 80 to 90 actually enforcing the DMA. That might not, that was enough in order to get us to the designation phase. We definitely need to ramp up, and we would welcome more staff, definitely. But it is sufficient to get the compliance phase underway and to enforce the obligations that are on the table. So I'm not so much worried about staffing, but obviously it would always be better in view of the staffing that is facing us when it comes to the gatekeepers, the many law firms and the many consultants that they hire. Obviously, we'll never be able to match those. But from my experience, smaller, nimble teams actually have an advantage sometimes, as opposed to huge teams where a lot of effort goes into coordination. And there's a lot of losses in the coordination. So I'm confident that we can actually do the job properly. Okay. With the staff that we have.
May I make a comment on that? I think that it's one of the great features of the DMA that it lists things that are not allowed with specificity. And that does make it different from some other antitrust laws. I'm most familiar with the ones in the United States, of course, but similar provisions apply here, that you have to define markets and prove harm to competition within them, and that you can prove that they're offsetting benefits, and those sorts of processes are incredibly labor-intensive and time-intensive. I think the DMA is structured in a way that's designed to let a smaller staff, again, a sufficiently large staff, but one that perhaps isn't as big as, say, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, handle a broad number of gatekeepers, because there is that clarity in the DMA that certain things are just not allowed anymore.
It's definitely a fair point, but I would just want to push back a little bit on that, because we are expecting some pushback from the gatekeepers. We're already seeing that investigations have been opened into what other core platform services could come under this, under gatekeeper status. I mean, how are you making sure that these rules are going to be enforced properly and enforced efficiently, while at the same time you've got this pushback going on at the moment? And how are you making sure that they're as effective as they can be?
One has to first start with the nature of the DMA. The nature of the DMA that it is first and foremost for the gatekeepers to come up with compliance plans and for us to check them. So we are not in the situation that we would be in an antitrust case, where the burden is on the Commission to prove that something wrong has happened. Here it is for the gatekeeper to show to us that they have fully complied. So we're already in a different ball game, if I may say so. So we will need to look very carefully into compliance measures. We will need to set priorities at one point in time, but for the time being, every obligation needs to be complied with, and that's on the gatekeepers to demonstrate to us, and then we will look very carefully at what is put on the table. So it's not comparable to a big antitrust investigation, where it is upon the Commission to prove every single piece of evidence has to come from the Commission, every single piece of evidence has to be turned around. Here it's for the gatekeepers to come to us, to provide us with plausible compliance plans against which we check. So the ball game is different here. And as you rightly say, this could be managed with a smaller number of people than as compared to a large, huge antitrust investigation, I would think.
Mm. And how does that look exactly? So you having gatekeepers, they're sending you sort of excerpts of their compliance reports, and they're asking, is this what you're looking for? Is that the sort of back and forth that we're seeing at the moment?
We're not talking about compliance reports or drafts, we're talking about compliance. So what we want to see is actual compliance on the ground. So we want to see the technical implementation. Let's take an example, choice screens. The DMA provides for choice screens for browsers or search engines. So what we want to see is not just that choice screens will be around and will be made available. We want to see how the setup looks like, what choices are provided, even the coloring and the buttons that you have to press, because we know that there's a lot you can do in terms of presentation. You can do wrong, actually, in terms of presentation, in terms of leading or misleading consumers into choices. So all of this needs to be checked carefully, and we are ready to do that.
Okay. I wanted to ask as well, because we've talked a lot about third-party involvement. I think Mozilla, I think it was last week, they funded a study into browser choice screens, and it was very detailed about the impact of where positioning could be and how that could affect how the browsers that people choose. So it's kind of a question for Avery, but also for Thomas. What kind of, how do you see that your company and your input in terms of academic studies supporting how compliance could look in the future? And to you, Thomas, what exactly would you specifically want more help understanding? So Avery, you go first.
Sure. So I think it's been shown time and time again that when consumers have to go through multiple steps, 27 clicks, there's drop-off along the way, right? I think there's a lot of academic work that's already demonstrated those kinds of points. I think that can be adapted to this context very easily as we look at, okay, what are the mock-ups of what's actually going to be the flow, the user experience that the gatekeepers are proposing in order to be compliant, and then making sure that jives with the experience of companies across a broad range of different types of apps, right? And other parts of the gatekeeper community, not just apps. But I think that we know that companies have a history of trying to protect their monopoly power by putting in obstacles along the way to other competitors in competition, right? We know that there's a history of non-compliance specifically related to app stores. If we look at situations like what happened in South Korea, what happened in the Netherlands. And so I think that you are already well aware of the kinds of challenges that they may try to come to you and say, this is compliant, and they actually won't be.
On a question where we would need help, I think what is particularly tricky are the technical conversations that we're going to have around security and integrity issues, because the DMA provides for, I don't want to call them exceptions, but at least the gatekeepers can provide justifications in terms of security that we need to check, whether they are proportionate, whether they actually serve the purpose. And that's going to be very difficult discussions, because it leads us into very deep into the engineering of certain of these products. And if, when we have engineering capabilities within the Commission, and we can rely on some of those, but it's never going to be enough to fully understand how, if you take the example of an app store, how a third-party app store would work, and what security checks you'd need to put in place in order to make it safe. These kind of things the market can best help us with, because those players that are already having apps on an app store, they know what kind of security threats there are, how do you counter them, and what are proportionate measures that don't go beyond what is absolutely necessary in order to protect consumer security on an app store, for instance. So that's where we would need most help, I would think.
I want to ask as well about the provision that we have in the DMA for it to be flexible and adaptable to fast-changing markets. One thing that we noticed in the designation period was that cloud service providers were kind of weren't really a feature in the designation. Is that something that you're looking at closely?
Yes, I think you shouldn't draw too many conclusions from the fact that in the first round of designations, cloud service providers were not integrated. That just means that, as we speak, none of these cloud service providers met the thresholds in the DMA. That doesn't mean that they're out of scope. That doesn't mean that we're not looking into it. It just means that in the first round of designations that we had, nobody was meeting the actual quantitative thresholds. But that certainly doesn't mean that there's no focus on cloud.
Andreas, with your implementation watchdog hat on, do you think that there are certain sectors where the qualitative thresholds, or the sort of choice to look into areas where there wasn't, where they don't meet the quantitative thresholds, do you think that could have been used better?
Well, obviously, everything can be improved, but it's clear that with the number of people that the Commission has, they had to focus at the beginning within 45 days, because this was a very, let's say, ambitious time frame that the European Parliament has given to them. They had to look on the most elementary cases. Therefore, we will for sure follow up on where qualitative assessments could make the point. But in the end, the DMA is about size. Outside the DMA, there is competition policy enforcement still available, as Olivier Garçon has pointed out in Florence recently. And that will also be needed. And the Commission has already launched some investigations in the area just before the DMA came into force, where it will matter. So I think we should not lose out of focus the fact that the DMA is there for size, and outside there is competition policy as in the past. And I think we have to push also the Commission not to forget about that, because with the DMA, there is also a big moral opening that in digital, it has to be done more for fair markets. It's true that with 40 people in DG Comp and 45 or 50 in DG Connect, it might be a bit difficult, and that's politics. We have to combine everything together, because member states, they were very eager to push for the DMA to be done. But when we asked them that they have also to transfer staff to the Commission, because they are doing now the job that national competition authorities have done beforehand, they said, well, now on this we cannot speak because we don't want to finance this. This doesn't work. If the European Union takes over capacities and power that member states have been exerting before, member states have also to pay for that, because that's the logics of the European Union. So we will also fight for that in the budget. And I think with more manpower, this can become better. And still, digital markets will keep some sort of flexibility. That's what they are done for. And therefore, a perfect control in the area of Article 5 and 6 will always be discussed, because what you may see as a fair assessment of screens and change possibilities may be seen differently by Thomas or someone else, and therefore there will always be some gray zone. But what is important is that we have a much better public focus on how competition is done in digital.
The question that we have on our poll today is what makes what is a measure of success for the DMA? And I'm really interested to hear from all three of you what you think that measure is.
There's several. I think that a big measure of success in the DMA is how many innovators decide that Europe is the place that they want to make their homes, to build their apps and other parts of the digital economy. So I'd look at innovation as one marker of success. Europe is leading the world here, and it's extraordinary. And I think there are going to be a lot of app developers in particular who follow my founder and CEO's lead and decide that Europe is the place to be. So innovation would certainly be one marker. I would look at a variety of others, including what's happening with pricing, right? That is one of the easiest ways that we measure things. And for a long time, people have said, well, things on the internet are free. That's not right. We all know that's not right. There are ways to measure those sorts of price effects, and also quality, right? What's the quality of the experience? Today, for example, there's only the App Store if you want to get on iPhones. I can imagine, as a parent, an alternative App Store environment that really carefully curates content for children. It's something that Apple has made an effort to do, and that's great. But if you are handing a phone over to a 12-year-old, you might want something that was even more carefully done, to have a smaller set of apps on it. That's not possible in today's world. So I guess that's going back to my first point, innovation. But it's also a measure of quality. What's the experience for the user here in Europe?
Well, I want to be very clear. The key change that has been done with the DMA is the change of burden of proof. It's not anymore for authorities to prove the wrongdoing with the last figures that they can find out. It's about companies to prove that they are respecting the law. This is amazing in these times. And it's also a change from the classic economy to the digital economy. That will be the main driver of all this. And it makes for sure the job for the Commission easier. But at the same time, if you allow me to say this, with the Article 5 and 6 being very strict based on existing case law conditions, for sure there is a bit a fear, not a risk, but a fear that we lose a bit the flexibility that existing competition policy has had. Because there the Commission always was able to invent a new unfair practice, going to court with it, and then having the court confirming it. In the DMA, that's a bit more complicated, but I think Article 5 and 6 are still very large, and for the next 10, 15 years, they will be enough. But we have also to consider that flexibility can be in fast-changing markets an effect that if you can apply it with the court immediately going on your case can be a strength that with the DMA might be a bit more difficult. But still, change of burden of proof is key.
For me, the DMA is all about creating opportunities. So I think the first yardstick for success is if companies take up these opportunities that the DMA should now provide to them in terms of being able to work with platforms, but also being able to compete against platforms. So on both fronts, I would hope that opportunities will be created so that you will be treated fairer on the platforms if you're reliant on a gatekeeping platform, but you'll also have opportunities to do your business outside the platform. Both of these are, I think, quite important. And if I may respond to Andreas Schwab's point on competition policy and competition law enforcement, I mean, it will not disappear. There will always be the DMA plus a complement in terms of competition law enforcement. And if something is not covered by the DMA, then the fallback will be, okay, let's see whether we can cover it with competition law tools. The DMA was meant to address the most egregious behavior, the most obvious behavior. It was not meant to address all of the problems in digital markets with gatekeepers, and therefore it has been, I think, carefully thought as a complement to current competition law enforcement so that the two are communicating vessels. So if the DMA doesn't address some behavior squarely, we can still use another tool, which is competition law enforcement. And I think both will have to work together in order to make digital markets work better.
Just to follow up on that point as well, I mean, you mentioned that it's a nimble team and that has a lot of advantage to it because you can adapt quickly. But how long does the nimble DMA team dedicate to thinking about the long-term aims of this legislation? Is it more sort of immediate action, or is there something in the back of everybody's minds about what you want to achieve in 10 years' time with this new rule book?
Well, as I said, we work in phases. So the first phase was the designation phase. The next phase will be how do we achieve immediate compliance? How do we check it? And then once this is in place, then we can look into the future, what needs to be changed, what needs to be adapted in the DMA. But one should not get ahead of oneself. I think it's better to focus on to put the journey into smaller trajectories, because otherwise you're just not gonna see the trees in the woods. No, you need to cut it down into palatable pieces so that you can work with it or on it.
It seems like a very organised way of doing things. I wanted to ask as well, because the world is watching. This is very new territory. The UK has its own digital bill that's going through the legislative machine at the moment. The US is, is basically there with digital markets rulemaking. So what kind of conversations are you having with counterparts in the US, and how do you and globally, and how do you see the Digital Markets Act kind of influencing policy worldwide?
There's a lot of conversations going on, as you can imagine. It's even topic in G7 discussions, how to regulate digital markets and what's the best way to do it. So I think the world is looking at the DMA as a kind of experiment, if I may say so, to see how it works in practice. The UK is already one step close to adopting legislation, but they're not the only ones. I mean, our Japanese colleagues are thinking about this. Colleagues in Australia have a series of reports where they're looking into digital markets. And in the US, there's a lot of litigation ongoing, and a lot of focus on digital markets as we speak. So these markets and the markets where gatekeepers are present are definitely in the focus of a worldwide debate, and there's a worldwide discussion going on what are the best tools to deploy in order to achieve common goals, actually. So this is really very much debated in many international fora.
Also, Brazil wants to do the same legislation. So it's, I think it's, as Thomas has said, it's a real worldwide issue. We had in Rome also, no, in Como, in another conference, there was also American participation. And I mean, the number of Section 2 cases in the US system is amazing. And what we have to understand is that, first of all, the transparency that digital markets give about competition has not been there in old markets. So I'm always using the example when a big car manufacturer, let's use Ford this time, has been asking for reduction of supplier costs in a very intransparent way, maybe years after you have seen that the company went down and you thought, well, they haven't had the good products anymore. But maybe it was just a competition case. Nowadays on your mobile, you see exactly what distorting practices there are. And everyone, and that can also be a chance for the global economy, everyone can follow him or herself about what fair practices are and what is unfair. Everyone will have a different assessment, but it's something which makes this extremely transparent. And I'm sure that the Commission will then also get calls to use Article 12.2 and to introduce new CPS that maybe so far are even not yet known.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, everybody, for your contributions. Avery, how optimistic are you that anything similar can take shape in the US?
Highly optimistic. When we worked on these pieces of legislation in the last Congress, what happened was amazing. I look at votes of 20-2 in the Senate Judiciary Committee and say, gosh, that just doesn't happen, right? Yes, the United States is polarized. Yes, it may be on the verge of a temporary shutdown, but it will be temporary. And the bipartisan support for reforms here is incredibly strong. The polling's incredibly strong, and the votes among the members in both the House and the Senate is very, well, the numbers speak for themselves, but the excitement about the issue and the will to get something done is really pretty unusual and very encouraging. So predicting a US legislative calendar is a tricky business, but I'm highly optimistic that with the level of support that these sorts of reforms have across the ocean and across the aisle in Washington, that we're going to get it done there too.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions. I really value talking to such clever people all day. It's one of my favourite parts of my job. I did say at the start that we wanted to take some questions from the audience, and I do have some on Slido here. There's one about, does the DMA readily apply to the metaverse, which I'm quite interested in. How are you seeing this kind of virtual worlds space in light of regulating digital markets in the future?
I mean, the DMA applies to core platform services, which you can find in the legislation. If these core platform services in the future rely on technologies like AI or move into the metaverse, the DMA will certainly apply. But the DMA cannot apply beyond these core platform services, because that's what the legislator has thought to be the scope of the DMA. That will need to be a legislative decision. If the Parliament and Council were to want to change that, we would have to go back to the drawing board, unless you would use the mechanism which is provided for in Article 12 to update some of the obligations to fit other core platform services. But generally, if AI or the metaverse find their emanation in current core platform services that are mentioned in the DMA is broad enough to capture these developments.
Could be a social network, for example, or an intermediation service.
Okay. If a gatekeeper only discloses to the Commission on the 6th of March how they intend to comply, how will the Commission ensure it has enough time to review and test that proposal?
Well, that's the whole point of the discussions we're having now, actually. We're trying to front-load this discussion so as not to be surprised on the 7th of March with proposals we haven't seen before. And that's in our interest, but it's also in the interest of gatekeepers. And as we speak, I think all of the 6 that we have designated are engaging in this process.
I actually want to pick up on that as well, because one thing that we haven't spoken about yet is some of the rhetoric that came from the gatekeepers once those designations came down. Now, Apple and TikTok both said that expressed disappointment. I know that you've already told me that you're not going to tell me which gatekeeper is saying what to you, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and ask how those discussions are going, if you do expect to see some challenges when that deadline comes, or if you expect to see a little bit of a struggle.
I think challenges are part of this exercise. It's the right of these companies to have a decision by the Commission reviewed by courts. We're living in a union based on the rule of law, so there's nothing that can be said against taking your case to court. And if it happens, the Commission will defend its decisions, and we are confident that our decisions will stand in court. Otherwise, it's the gatekeepers or the designated gatekeepers' decision whether they want to bring issues to court or not, and how they want to discuss with us in parallel. That's really their business and not ours. We are open for discussion. If a company doesn't want to discuss, then obviously we cannot.
That's a perfect comment, I think, on a legal basis. That's the technical approach of the Commission. I would say politically, gatekeepers have a huge interest to embrace the new rules, because there will also be a political logics behind. And although we are discussing every day about who could look for a court case, I think it will be politically not easy for one or for 2 companies to go out and to say, this rule-based approach of Article 5 and 6, which is based on existing court cases, is not what we like. You can for sure try politically as well, but it will be very difficult to explain after if you have lost. So I believe that there is, and I mentioned it already before, also in that conference in Rome, it was an element. I believe that it's rather a rule that will be embraced, also to use it for, let's say, looking for opportunities of gatekeepers that are not yet in all CPS present, and secondly, also in the areas where they are present, to protect a bit themselves against national competition authorities, American investigations or whatever. So I'm rather confident on this, politically speaking, and legally I think Thomas has said everything.
I'm interested as well, obviously, core platform services can get designated at a later date. How do you see those conversations? Are you planning to warn companies if they're getting to a position where they might need to consider this as part of one of the core platform services under which they're a gatekeeper. Is this a kind of movable feast of a conversation that you're going to be having with big tech companies?
I think based on the experience we had so far, companies know very well whether they're going to be within scope or not. They're actually watching out in terms of their figures, whether they're going to reach the thresholds or not. So I'm not so worried that the company would overlook its potential gatekeeping status and would not notify. I mean, these are big companies we're talking about, and these are companies who have a due diligence to do, and to also have reporting obligations. So I'm not concerned that the company would just not notify. I mean, there's also fines attached to that if it ever comes to it, but I don't think that we will reach that point.
Mm. How much of the unit's time do you think is going to be taken up on investigations, just trying to work out what is and is not, or what does and does not qualify as a gatekeeper going forward, and how much of it do you think is going to be in active investigations about bad acting?
I think we are through the phase of trying to figure out what is a gatekeeping service and what is not. That was the designation phase. We had 45 days to figure that out. We put that on paper. There's a decisions out there. So this is now, this sets the rules. And now we are really looking into compliance. We are looking into how gatekeepers will comply with the obligations in the Articles 5, 6, and 7.
Okay. On that point,
yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is the DMA includes some very strong language about anti-retaliation. And this is something that we've heard about a lot over the years, that companies are scared to speak out against gatekeepers because by definition, the gatekeepers control access to the customers they need for their business to survive. And the DMA has very strong provisions about anti-retaliation. I think they're wonderful. I hope it won't be necessary to use them, but I think that's another phase of enforcement that is a tool in this effort to make greater levels of competition throughout the European digital markets.
Mm. I've got one last question from the audience as well. In practice, how will the DMA unbundle payments from gatekeepers' core platform services, creating space for consumers to use third-party payment solutions? What does that look like in practice?
Oh, there's many different dimensions to that. There's the interoperability provision in Article 6.7, which hopefully will provide at one point in time on the 7th of March access to features of the operating system which are needed for payment. I'm talking about NFC, for instance. There is a provision in the DMA about in-app payment services in Article 5.7, which will allow app stores to choose the payment system for in-app purchases that they would want to have and not the one that is imposed by the gatekeeper. So there's a variety of dimensions where payment services come into play, and we'll work on all of those. Mm-hmm. And make sure that they're implemented by the 7th of March.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's going to be very exciting to see how this compliance actually works in practice, and getting things off the ground. Thank you, all three of you, for taking the time to speak to me today. This has been really enjoyable, and thank you for being such a terrific audience as well. And last but not least, I'd like to hand over to my editor, Aoife, who's going to give us some closing remarks.
Hello, and thank you to all of our panelists and speakers for joining us today to talk about Europe's digital decade, and especially for speaking so openly. Despite what Mrs. Jourova said, I think she did her best, and it was very interesting to hear that she won't be back with us. It was something we're very sorry about. I hope you all heard something that sheds some new light or sparks some new ideas. Thanks also to our partner Qualcomm for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please feel free to email us about the event at live@politico.eu. We have more events to come, so please take a look at our events lineup to see what else is coming this year. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.